share their expertise and their experiences that they have had with and joining us in a mental health conversation. May we pray. Dear Lord, we are so grateful for this opportunity, Lord, to learn how we can be the hands and feet of Christ in our community with people who are suffering either from mental health issues or in other ways. Lord, we pray for those who are grieving. We know, Lord, that specifically in our church, we have a couple of families that are grieving the loss of a loved one, and we lift them up to you and ask that you bring them peace and comfort. But Lord, we also know there are other people who are grieving, who have not lost a loved one, but are watching them leave them. Those who are experiencing dementia problems, Lord, those who are involved in other health issues, Lord, that cause them to stray away from their family. And we just pray, Lord, that you will give them comfort and peace and give them a sense of your presence each day. Lord, we know there are no easy answers, and we know that you will guide us, and we ask for your direction for this church, that you will help us to know how to go about doing your will and reaching out to those who most need you the most. Father, we are so grateful that you died for all of us, and we're so grateful for your love, and these things we say in your name. Amen. Our WMU team today consists of 4 women, and I'm going to introduce Laura to you, and I'm going to ask Laura to do the rest. If she would come up, she is the head of our missions for WMU, and from the state of Richmond. All of these women, I'm assuming, live in Richmond or they're in the suburbs of Richmond, and they have formed a team to go about and do what they're doing today for people to help churches learn more about how to be witnesses to those who are experiencing mental health issues. So, Laura, would you come forward, please?
Good morning. First of all, thank you so much for showing up on a Saturday morning in the springtime when we're all ready to be outside. We very much appreciate your dedication to being here and to be here for this very, very important issue, and for your dedication for being here. And Ann, it's been great being able to talk with her, so thank you, Ann, for inviting us. My name is Laura Davis. I'm the Missions Engagement Director for Women's Missionary Union of Virginia. I'd like to introduce our fabulous team to begin with. Kathy Berry, if you'll just, and they may all explain and talk a little bit more about themselves, and I hope they do, because I'm going to forget things otherwise. But Kathy is a retired hospice chaplain, and her husband, Bill, is actually walking the Appalachian Trail, so we've been following his story and journey over the last few months. And she is also the author of a book that deals with caring for the caregiver, which is about dementia. And, of course, Kathy can share much more about that. Ann Teal Gargiulo, and it's Ann Teal. She is a teacher, works with special ed students as well as history with some of the 12th and 11th grade year students as well. She is the team leader for the Hope arm of the mental health team, the mental health arm of the Hope team. And Sarah White is also with us today, and she is a licensed counselor and works with the Community Service Board in Goochland area, and also is a dog lover. So, wanted to share a little bit about them. I bring you greetings from our Executive Director Treasurer, Dr. Valerie Carter Smith, and our Board of Trustees. We actually just had a board meeting last weekend at Camp Crossroads. If I'm going to tell you a little bit about Crossroads in just a second, but there are some exciting things happening because of women like you that are making missions happen in this state. So thank you, and just keep a lookout for that. Women's Missionary Union of Virginia is a movement of women that seeks to equip every person to join Christ where God is at work in this world. WMUV aims to fulfill our purpose through missions education, through involvement, through support, and through camping experiences. So we move through praying, giving, going, learning, and living a missions lifestyle. Now, the Hope WMUV team provides education about topics that are relevant in our world today with the intention of being able to provide missional responses. Specifically, we seek to bring education and resources in a way that provides opportunities for mission support and involvement. We work together in the hope of Christ. Our Hope WMUV team consists of a mental health team, a domestic violence team, and a human trafficking team. And you can learn more about WMUV by visiting our website and our Facebook page. Our website is currently under construct. Well, we're getting ready to change to a new website. Our old website's still in the works, but we're getting ready to change to a new one. Couple of things to let you know. In your seat was an annual report. If you're not familiar with WMUV, you can get a good overview by looking at this. Over here on this table is a lot of very good resources specifically about mental health, but there's also a few things WMUV. We have a Crossroads Summer Camp, which is in Piney River, which is between Lovingston, well, really close to Lovingston, between Lovingston and Madison Heights, but much closer to Lovingston. And they are doing some great things, and they've adapted camp this year because of COVID, and just doing some wonderful things. So you can learn more there. And if you want to get on our e-news, it comes out twice a month. We don't sell your email to anybody, but this is probably the best resource that you can get is the e-news, because it's got the most up-to-date information. There's little cards over there. If you just want to put your name and your email address, that's all we need, and then you can get on that list. Any questions about any of that? No? Okay. Well, without further ado, Kathy Berry, if you will please come up and join us.
Well, good morning. It's so good to be here with you all today. And this is a beautiful day, isn't it? Don't you wish you could kind of freeze days like this and just keep it for a long time? But we know the summer is coming. Well, I'm going to talk with you for just a moment about caregiving. And most of my ministry has been with people who have dementia and their caregivers. So what I will say definitely speaks to that, but it also talks just about being caregivers in general. Have any of you all been or are you a caregiver? Anybody? Okay. I would say most of us in our life have been caregivers at one time or another, through someone's sickness that may be temporary or long-term. So it just depends. But most caregivers have, by nature of what it's called, caregiving, you are giving of yourself. And quite often as a caregiver, we don't take care of ourselves. And other people don't always know exactly how to take care of us. And I think, too, for caregivers, quite often we don't know how to ask for help. And we don't ask for help because we feel like we should be able to do it all. But that is not healthy for us, because if you give and give and give, what eventually happens? You give out. Exactly. And you've heard caregiver burnout. You've probably heard that expression. So we need to do things that nurture our spirit. We need to find ways to reach out to people when we need help and know that it's okay to ask for help. So we're going to just talk about some of the different ways that we can be a help to caregivers. Because I know many of us want to do something, but quite often we don't know exactly what to do. Have you found that to be true? And if a caregiver is hesitant to ask for help, but we know they might need help, then we don't know how, anyway, so it can become a vicious cycle where we may not do anything, but we may want to do something. So we're going to talk just for a few minutes about, let's see. Okay. Which button do I press to make it advance? It didn't. Oh, it's behind. See, I knew I was going to mess that up. Knew I would, because it's working that, but not this. Okay, here we go. So ministering to caregivers, I think that the most important thing is to listen. Because if you are a caregiver or have been a caregiver, how is it to receive advice from other people when they feel like they know what you're going through and they need to tell you how to do what you need to do? In the Bible, there's a good example of this. In the book of Job, we see that Job, man, he went through so many trials and tribulations, about the worst you can have, your whole family being annihilated, all your livelihood. Anyway, so he went through a lot of really hard times. Do you remember that he had friends that came to be with him? Friends came to be with him, and for a while, they sat with him, didn't they? They sat with him in the ashes, it says in the Bible, and were just there and present and listening. But what happened after a while? Did they start giving him advice? Yes. They started telling him what he needed to do, and even worse than that, why he was in that shape. So I feel that the most important thing we can do for caregivers is to listen, to give them a listening ear. And listening comes in all different styles, doesn't it? Listening may be very actively just listening to someone talk if they need to talk, but it can also be being present and sitting when they don't talk. Because like I said, a lot of caregivers don't know how to ask for help, maybe don't know how to share their feelings. So to be a good listener involves building up trust, doesn't it? And a lot of times that happens when you're present. You're just there with someone in their time of need. And then when they're ready to talk, or if they want to share what's going on, they'll feel more comfortable doing that because they know you've been present with them and you care. And so it's very important to be faithful and consistent. Alzheimer's, and dementia are long-term illnesses. And a lot of folks who are caregivers may be dealing with a short-term problem that their loved one is facing. Perhaps they've had a heart attack and need to recuperate from that, or they've broken a bone and need to recuperate from that. So their caregiving may be temporary, but there are illnesses and other things that happen in people's lives that are long-term. And dementia is one of those. If you have Alzheimer's, which is a form of dementia, it can last an average of 8 years, and it can go as much as 20 years. In our churches, we're really, really good at ministering to people during crisis and when things first happen. But over a 8 to 20 year period, that's a long time to be a consistent and faithful friend. And so that's what we really need to think about. How can we be a consistent support? And I advise churches, most churches that I know of, have a team of deacons or a pastoral care team or some type of team of folks. So it's not just one person helping out a family that needs long-term ministry. And we can't also rely on the pastor or the associate pastor or the church staff to do it, because as we know, things change and sometimes staff move on, so it needs to be church members that are consistently supporting and faithful to the people they're caring for. It's very important when you are trying to help a caregiver to also remember the person they're caring for. Sometimes it's tempting, or it's not tempting, but when you are talking, and say you're in a living room and they're the caregiver, the person they're caring for, and you, sometimes it gets to be a conversation between the caregiver and you, the person coming to visit, and the person who's experienced an illness might be sitting there not really paid attention to. So we need to make sure that as we're visiting someone, that we're offering support not just to the caregiver, but to the person that they love and are caring for. And when you do that, it really, for the caregiver, that really nurtures their spirit and soul to know that you care and love the person they care and love. So you're there for both of them. Okay, make sure I'm on the right page. Very, very important to recognize that a caregiver has all different kinds of emotions, just like we all do. Do we all have good days? And then we all have bad days. And sometimes in the same day, it can be really good, or something can happen to make it not good. And so we need to recognize and be willing to accept whatever that caregiver is feeling, whatever their emotions are. And it's very important to be non-judgmental. Just I was talking about Job's friends. They listened for a while, but after a while they got very judgmental. Another thing is to be confidential. When you go into someone's home and are visiting with them, providing care of whatever kind, you want to be sure and listen to what they have to say, but not leave there and go tell everybody. We want to let caregivers tell their story to who they trust to tell their story to. Does that make sense? So that we're allowing them to share. They have honored us by sharing with us, but we need to keep that to ourselves. Now, I'm not saying you can't go back to the pastor or the minister who does visitation and say, you might want to go see Barbara, she's having a rough time, but we don't need to go into everything. So let them tell their story. I think that's very important. Sometimes caregivers, I've noticed especially with dementia of different kinds, it's a slow process. And sometimes the caregiver, the family member, notices long before anybody else things that are going on because they're directly caring for that person. And that's true of other illnesses too. So sometimes when you go to a doctor and they only see the person for 5 minutes, maybe 10, they don't get the whole picture, do they? And sometimes they can't hear what you're saying, and so you go home with no help. And I'm just saying sometimes you need to say, well, maybe you should seek out a neurologist, or maybe you should seek out a specialist to talk about this, and not feel like you just have to stop with the primary care, because sometimes you need to go beyond that to find out, to get a diagnosis for something that's more significant. Now, I think it's important when we go and visit that we make our visit spiritually based, like we're offering spiritual care. So not, if you are a deacon of the church or a minister, you could bring Holy Communion. That might be something that they're really missing. If they're having to stay at home with the person they care for, they're not having the opportunity to receive communion. They're also not having the opportunity to be with the church as a body. So you could take the bulletin. Unfortunately, I worked in long-term care as well as hospice, and sometimes I would notice as I went to visit folks that had dementia, sticking in their mail slot would be a church bulletin. Well, the folks with dementia can't really tell what that, to them, they wouldn't look at it and be able to remember those songs, remember those scriptures. So that is something you could do. You could take a bulletin and just go down and sing the songs with them and have prayer with them and read the scripture that's in there, and then tell them maybe a little bit about what the sermon was anyway. So that's just a simple thing you could do. Or you could take a devotion book and share a devotion with them and have prayer. And I think it's very important too, before you leave, to offer a blessing, to thank them for what they are doing, and to bless the person they're caring for. Oh, okay. Go with sometimes a caregiver, especially someone who has a family member they're caring for that has dementia. When they have to go to a doctor's appointment, it's very difficult to drive, then to park, and to get out and to walk that way with the person they're caring for. It's a nice thing if you offer to take them to a doctor's appointment where you could drop them off at the door, and you could wait in the car, or you could go wait with the person in the waiting room, just whatever they're comfortable with. But that takes the pressure off of them of having to go through all those steps of parking and then getting into the building. It's also true for someone who is caring for somebody who's broken something or needs to be in a wheelchair and transport into a wheelchair. That just really eases up the processes that they have to do. Okay. So, like I was saying, not all caregivers know what to ask for. Sometimes when you're a caregiver, you're so overwhelmed with all the things that you're doing that you don't know how to ask somebody to help you. It's hard to know where to begin. So sometimes we have to be really on the lookout ourselves. How often do we say to one another when we come to church, "Hey, Jane, how you doing?" That's a pretty common expression, isn't it, that we greet people that way? And sometimes we walk by each other saying that. "How are you doing?" And we don't even wait. We hear the fine as they walk by. We're expecting people to say fine, and we say fine lots of times even when we're not fine. Have you found that to be true in your life? So I'm saying we need to really pay attention to folks, to their body language. Now, I'm not saying if they say fine, and you can tell they're not fine, to go up and say, "I can see you're really not fine." Don't do that. But if you can tell by body language, usually you can tell when someone's really tired, can't you? they'll be kind of hunched over, or they might have dark circles under their eyes, or they might just, their voice might be kind of just sad and depressed sounding. So pay attention to those things and follow up with a call or a visit and say, you know, it's good to see you at church. Just wanted to check on you and see how you're doing. I know this has got to be hard. See what I'm saying? So even if they don't, even if they say fine, we can tell when someone is truly not fine. And we do that too often. I think we, as a whole, need to be better at saying, well, you know, I'm going through a pretty rough time, or what has this year been like for y'all? I'm just throwing that out in general. Has this been an easy year? I have not met anybody who has said, this has been a great year. I've loved being isolated, and I've loved not being able to see my loved ones, and getting a shot that I'm trusting that everything's okay. I mean, so there's so many unknown factors that we've been going through that most of us are not fine. It's been a hard year, and it's okay to say that, because when we say these things, then people know how to support us. And they also probably resonate with us and say, you know, it's been that way for me too. And so we really have more honesty and more trust with each other. So it's okay sometimes to say, I'm not really doing too great, or I've had better days, or whatever. Okay. So for caregivers, as we're looking for ways that we can help them, many times we can help them with tangible things. Like, I had a gentleman in our church who's going through cancer treatment for lymphoma. And he is like this. His love in life is gardening. His yard is like pristine, just amazing. And he can't do it. Here comes spring, and all the weeds are starting to come back in his beautiful flower beds that he's just taken such good care of. So what's something you could do? Offer to come over and pull some weeds. His partner that he lives with is not able to do everything all the time and goes to work. And anyway, it's just been a really confusing situation for him. And we have asked him if we can come gardening. Do you know what he said? No. Do you know why? It's too hard for him to watch other people doing the things he wants to be doing. And so he's just really had a hard time accepting that other people want to help him. So that's another thing I'm saying to those of us as caregivers. We give a gift to people by allowing them to help us. You know? Don't you feel like when you're able to help someone do something they really need, that it makes you feel like you have received a blessing? And so it's not just them that receives the help, it's you too. So I try and help people see it's okay to ask for help. People want to help. But looking for those tangible things, you might, when you're at the grocery store, you could call your friend who's home caring for someone. You could call and say, hey, I'm at the grocery store. Would you like me to pick up XYZ for you? Or if they say, no, I'm fine, you know, you might pick up a treat for them. Something that you found out maybe they like a lot. And you could take that to them. So look for those ways that you can do things in the fall. Everybody has lots of leaves in their yard. You could go rake leaves, you know, just other kinds of things like that. Taking a meal to them is also important, and that's one thing we do really well. Offering respite as you get to know this, for example, someone who has dementia, their caregiver's with them 24/7, and they become very dependent on that caregiver, sometimes kind of attached at the hip. That caregiver needs a break ever so often. So if we have built up a trusting relationship and a friendship, the person who has dementia may allow us to be with them for a while, so the caregiver could run to the store, could even stay at the house but go in the backyard and do gardening, or go in their bedroom and read a book while you're visiting with the person they care for. So it doesn't mean you have to stay overnight. It means you can offer just some breaks. You could also offer to host a dinner at your home. That is a very wonderful, isn't it wonderful to go to people's homes and share meals? That makes everybody feel good. The person that's offering the meal and the person that's there. And for people who are having a hard time, no matter what it is they're going through, just to be in someone's home in a relaxed environment with good food is a relaxing, nurturing thing. So that's something we can do, as well as taking food to them. But again, that would involve talking to the caregiver. What does this person like to eat? What can I prepare that's good for them? So just another idea. The caregiver may need to just process some things that are going on. And they may need to tell you some very important things that they're dealing with, choices that they're dealing with. Lots of folks, as they get older, may need, at some point, the caregiver may not be able to give them all the care they need. So they may be at a point of talking about going into an assisted living facility or something like that, which is a very difficult discussion to have and a very difficult time. So maybe they just need a sounding board. Maybe they just need you to listen to what they are thinking. Not that you can solve the problems. Have you ever found that people are sometimes really good at giving advice and they know exactly what you should do? Well, nobody knows exactly what you need to do, right? We have to make those decisions ourselves and decide what is best for the person we love. But we can also, there are resources over here on the table. Some of them are for caregivers of folks that have dementia, but some are for other kinds of mental illnesses. And so we can help point people toward resources. Like if they're not familiar with the Alzheimer's Association, we could tell them about that. We could even go with them to a support group. There are lots of good support groups out there, not just for Alzheimer's, but for people that have Parkinson's, for people that have brain injuries. There's a support group out there for most anything. But you know, a lot of caregivers are hesitant to go to support groups. Why do you think that is? What do you think makes people hesitate? Do any of us like to spill the beans or share, especially with strangers? No, it's hard. It's really hard. But everyone who's coming to that support group is kind of in the same boat in a way. They're going through not everything exactly the same, but so if we offer to go with someone to a support group and be their support, they have a familiar person with them, just to help kind of break the ice as we're there with them for the first time. They're not alone. And then after that, they may feel comfortable enough to go to that support group by themselves once they get used to it. So that's just an idea. Mm-hmm. Oh, I thought you were going to ask me a question. Yeah. Now this is a very, very important one to think about. When you are caregiving, yes, there are a lot of caregivers who are very hesitant to ask for help. But there are some caregivers who are not hesitant at all and who will ask for a lot. And you may not be able to do all that they are asking. And then what happens is, quite often, if we go into a situation and there's so much going on and they need so much and they become dependent on us thinking that we can do everything for them or solve every problem, we can't do that, can we? And we have to know our limits. We have to know what it is we're capable of doing. Are we just capable of taking them to doctor's visits? Are we capable of going and visiting once a week and having a devotional? Are we capable of going for an hour a couple times a month and listen? So know what you can do and be able to say, I can't do that, but I'll try and help find someone who can. That's when you go back to the church, if you have a team of people who visit and say, can anybody else do this for Ms. Jones? Or you say to your minister, I'm visiting with her, but there's so many needs that I can't handle. Could I ask you to maybe step in and maybe you can help find some resources? So I think it's important to know your boundaries and not feel bad about having to say, I don't know how to do that, or I don't have the time to do that. Because what happens if we don't do that is we get overwhelmed, don't we? And if we get overwhelmed, what do? We step back. And then we leave that person without anyone visiting or feeling like we don't care. When we really do care, we just can't do it all. So knowing your boundaries is a very important part of being a caregiver, caring for a caregiver. So, that's it, yeah. Do y'all have any particular questions about caregiving, or you might want to think on it? But being a caregiver it's a wonderful responsibility, but it's a very hard responsibility. When you love someone, that's a part of love, isn't it? Is caring for them, even the hard parts. And we're going to do it. but it is not easy, and we need help. And so let's remember that we need to reach out to offer help. And as a caregiver, my mother-in-law had Alzheimer's. She was diagnosed at it started about 70, and she lived to be 86. So it was a long, long journey. And like I said, that's the way it is for a lot of folks. And quite often we didn't know how to ask for help. We didn't know what to say. But we found that as we allowed people to come in, as we allowed people to visit, we just felt so much more support than we did when we wouldn't. So the main thing is to just go out in love, to not be afraid, and to offer the love of God to everybody. So thank you. And next.
Thank you, Kathy. And Sarah White is getting ready to come up, but while she is, yes. And we should have brought your book just so people could see it, but I didn't even think about it. But while Sarah is coming up, just want to let you all know that we are going to have a panel at the end of this evening, or this morning. Goodness gracious, this morning. And so if you guys have questions, please write them down. Otherwise, we're just going to be staring at each other. So come up with some questions to be able to ask our panelists. Thank you.
Good morning. I am the soft-spoken one. Can y'all hear me okay? Okay. If I ever wander too far from this microphone, please feel free to give me, a wave or something as exactly. There we go. I appreciate you. I'm going to be looking at you as we go. So as she said, I'm Sarah White. I was actually brought to our Hope team by my mother, who was on here first. She couldn't join us today, but she told me that there was this great group of women who were going around sharing about mental health and wanted to know if I could come in and share a little bit too. And I love my mental health. I love talking about mental health. That's why I'm a counselor. And so as we go through my PowerPoint today, once it comes up here, there's a lot of information on that. I'm a mover and a shaker. We're going to be covering a whole lot of information. So please, if there's things you have questions about, write a note, grab me later. I'm happy to explain further. This is going to be just kind of a general overview of depression, a few different types of it, some things we can do, and also some kind of no-goes of maybe things we should try to avoid that haven't been helpful for people. And unfortunately, I will be looking up a lot, so me and the mic are going to be turning. Also, to the live stream individuals, thank you so much for joining us. So first we start with some misconceptions about depression, because I think there's a lot of misinformation out there. I actually spoke to some people on social media who have dealt with mental health, who have struggled, and all of these quotes up here are things that people have really said to individuals who struggle with mental health. You'll see everything about, a best friend can talk you out of depression, that you need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, that mental health isn't real, it's all in your head. All sorts of things up here. Depression doesn't run in families. Just mind your mind. You can choose happiness, and some of these have aspects of truth to them, but none of them are true alone. And in fact, there's one that steps on some toes up here, which is all you need is God. And I think God is a huge, important part of what we need, but sometimes we need some help too. And that's why that's one of those misconceptions that's up here. And so I may not hit each one of these as we go through, but some of these are kind of the popular misconceptions. First is just that if you're sad, you're depressed. And not necessarily. If you think of a big old Target symbol, that outer ring might be sadness, but as we move closer in, there's different forms of depression, and we're going to break that down here in just a few minutes. Another is that only weaker people get depressed, and let me tell you, working in counseling, not true. Some of the strongest people I know show up in my office, and they have been being strong for so long that eventually it gives out. It's like having a good car. You can have the best one on the market, but if you drive it from here to California a few times, it's going to need some work. It breaks down after a while. Another is that you have to think positive. Just snap out of it. Just, mind your thoughts. And again, partial truth here. We do need to watch our thoughts with depression. We challenge them. We work on that. But just thinking happy thoughts isn't always enough. There's also that depression is caused by traumatic events. And for some people, this is true. You might have a major loss, a major pain in your life that contributes to that depression. but it can also just hit you like a transfer truck, out of nowhere. I might be the most balanced mom. I have everything together. I serve, I volunteer, and bam, depression's got me. Out of nowhere. Nothing happened. It just hit me. Another is that, and this is to the gentleman because I hear this far too much, real men don't get depressed. And let me tell you, every man that has ever been in my office is a real man. Totally human, definitely male. But men get depressed too, and in fact, sometimes to a greater rate, because our society has this tendency to kind of say that guys don't have feelings, and you should swallow your feelings, and you should just tough it up, man up, say nothing. What do you think happens to that burning coal that they are swallowing and sharing with no one? It keeps burning, absolutely, and eventually that sucker can burn the house down. Others are that all you need is a pill. So if I just take my meds, that will be enough to kick my depression. And again, I'm not anti-medication. Meds can help a lot of people, but sometimes that's not enough. Sometimes I need to talk. Sometimes I need lifestyle changes. Sometimes I need friends. Another is that kind of all you need is time in nature, more sleep, kind of that good self-care stuff, which again, not untrue. If your sleep is completely off kilter, you're not going to feel good. But sleep alone may not be enough to address depression. And then people with depression have to stay on medication for the rest of their lives. Again, no, not necessarily. In some cases, maybe. In some cases, this may be, maybe I did have one of those life events. Maybe it's postpartum. And all I need is some time to get my body re-regulated, and I may not need that med anymore. So again, a lot of these are partial truths, and a lot of fiction too. And then this last one, I kind of mentioned a few times already, and you'll hear it a few more, that depression is all in your head. And in a few minutes, we will see that it does show up in our head, just like diabetes, your pancreas. It may show up in the pancreas, but it affects a lot of other things. It is contained to our skull, but it is not all in our head. And so again, there are many types of depression, and I'm going to go through these somewhat quickly. First is depressed mood, followed by major depressive disorder, followed by bipolar disorder. And I always tell people, please don't think this is comprehensive. There's a whole lot of other mental health diagnoses that include depression, like adjustment disorder, postpartum depression, some forms of schizoaffective disorder. This is the very small Cliff Notes version from a very big book that our DSM, which we kind of call our mental health Bible, looks a lot like a family Bible, one of those big, thick books. This is the Cliff Notes version, so please don't take this for the limit of it. All right, so depressed mood is our first thing we're going to talk about. This is kind of that very short-term feeling down. I might be a little bit blue, might have some low energy. Maybe my sleep is either a little too much or a little not enough, but typically just depressed mood is for a few days. So like if I've been applying for a great job and I got that email back that said, "Thank you so much for applying." No. Next few days I might be grieving that a bit. I might feel down. I was really hoping for that. But with depressed mood, this is not where we get into kind of that clinical realm. This is something that after a few days, some support with my friends, maybe a good talk with my mom, I might start picking up a little bit. So I might have that period of grieving. But major depressive disorder is where we hit about 2 weeks. That's our first magic number here. 2 weeks of several symptoms, typically 5 or more, one of which is either that depressed mood most days or loss of pleasure. So if my life used to have a lot of flavor, it was Baskin-Robbins 31 flavors, and all of a sudden it just became wallpaper paste. Nothing has flavor anymore. Not literal flavor, of course, but that zest of life. One of those two things is one of those key indicators for depression, and then we might also see appetite changes, up or down, sleep changes, up or down, focus and attention issues. If I used to be able to read a whole chapter of a book, but then I just can't sit with it anymore. Those, again, may be some of our warning signs. You also might notice irritability, and then it says psychomotor agitation or retardation, big fancy book word for that kind of agitation is where I'm just moving around, maybe tapping my foot a lot, just can't sit still, kind of got the jitters a little bit. And retardation is, of course, that slow-mo. You might notice that the person who's normally zipping from one end of the church to the other to greet everyone just looks like someone put glue in their shoes. And again, we have fatigue or loss of energy, so I might feel down, depressed, and no energy for anything, just can't get that get up and go. Concentration, feelings of worthlessness, or inappropriate guilt. So maybe, again, I'm that mom who's on top of everything, but I feel like the worst mom in the world. Can't put my finger on it, but just I can't see it. And again, you also may have thoughts of suicide or self-harm, thoughts that just, I feel so down that I don't even think tomorrow is worth it. So this slide is kind of a little bit of that book stuff where basically it has to cause significant disturbance, which if I'm feeling depressed most days of the week, it probably is. You might see it impact your work, you might see it impact your family, you might see it impact school if it's a child, but that it has a significant impact on something. That it's not caused by a medication I'm taking, because some medications can impact our mental health and have kind of adverse side effects. And that it's not attributable to another diagnosis. So that's kind of all the other category in that big book we talked about. And this is what I talk about in your head. I love this slide. On the left, you will see a very blue brain with just a few little light yellow marks. That is a PET scan of someone's brain who's dealing with clinical depression. You'll notice it's not very lit up, but if we look at the right, that is an individual who is not diagnosed with clinical depression, and you can literally see the sunlight in the brain. It is lit up differently when you are depressed versus when you are not. So when you say, I hear people say, it's all in your head, again, contained there, but it shows up on scans. This is not something we're imagining. This is my brain functioning differently when I'm dealing with depression. And you can find these PET scans for a lot of different mental health diagnoses, including bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, where you can see it lighting up differently as a result of the illness they're struggling with. So often we just don't know how to measure it. You know, we know high blood pressure now because we can put on the cuff and see it. Most people won't get a PET scan to diagnose their depression, but they did this so you can see that just like that blood pressure cuff, we just need the right thing to show, no, this exists. So bipolar disorder comes in two flavors. Bipolar, if you think of, again, two poles, up and down. In this up phase, that's not just our average happy. That's a little too much. And sometimes it's not happy, sometimes it's irritable. But the difference between the two flavors of bipolar is just how often this goes on. So is it at least 4 days with bipolar 2, 2 is our short version, or is it at least a week with bipolar 1? And that week versus 4 days is in that up phase. So bipolar includes that major depression that we already talked about, again, the at least 2 weeks of low mood. Bipolar also includes an up, where in the manic phase you might see someone who's talking really, really fast about everything and you just can't get a word in edgewise and it's just going like this and you can't, hold on, Sarah, I need to ask you something, but no, I got to tell you all of the things. That's called pressured speech. Sometimes it sounds like someone pressed fast forward and it's just going. They're also typically more distractible, where I can't keep my focus. I might be more impulsive, where I started 3 home projects, none of which I can complete. I may get involved in risky behavior, might be gambling, starting new impulsive relationships that don't follow my normal boundaries. And again, increased goal-directed behavior, sleep is one of the big things too. Maybe I'm only sleeping like an hour or 2 a night, but I don't really miss it. I'm kind of like the Energizer bunny that's just going and going and going and going, but you can tell that's not healthy at this point. And again, you may not have all of these symptoms, but there's a certain number that would tell a trained professional, yeah, we might be dealing with a manic phase here. And again, this requires you meeting both criteria of depression and mania. And with bipolar disorder, about 6.1 million American adults are living with this. That doesn't even include our kids. Kids can struggle with this too. And this is just in America, so this isn't worldwide. So treatment, again, I have some biases here because I'm one of those people, but there are many different options, the first of which we mentioned is counseling. Counseling is typically talking with another trained professional. On average, it's about an hour. The frequency may be different, so it could be a few times a week. It could be, about weekly, which is typically the average, every other week, or even like once a month for a check-in. But this is where you would talk through some issues, look at those thoughts, work on kind of challenging, making some life changes to support that, processing things, having a place to talk it out and work it out in a confidential space where, for example, there might be things I need to talk to a counselor that I wouldn't talk to my mom about. I love her to pieces, but just not ready to share that with her. Another option is medication. Again, multiple kinds of medication. There's a lot of very shorthand things on here like SSRI, mood stabilizer, and anti-anxiety medication. That may sound a little bit surprising, but depression and anxiety work together in a really bad way. If you've ever seen that Asian symbol, the yin-yang, black on one side, white on the other, little dot of each on the other side, to me that's very good imagery for how depression and anxiety work, because if I'm getting depressed and I'm not very motivated and I'm running out of energy, I'm probably not getting certain things done. Like maybe I didn't balance the checkbook this month or pay that bill, and then the anxiety starts. Because what if they cut off my electricity? How am I going to pay that bill back? What is my boss going to do when they find out I've been missing work? And so they can feed on each other. So sometimes in the medications, we're treating both because it's two sides of a coin. You know, one feeds the other, and it becomes a nasty cycle. Here's some of the ones that we don't always talk about. This one is electroconvulsive therapy, also called ECT. This is where they apply little electrodes to the side of your head. Most people have seen like ye old TV where it looks like a giant switch and there's this giant helmet and it's big sparks. Dark ages of mental health, we didn't always start out on the best foot. We have honed this to where instead of shocking the entire brain, it targets very specific centers of the brain. And a lot of times you'll hear me say, and for reasons we don't completely understand, but we can document, this electropulse several times, typically it's every few weeks, I believe, yes, 3 to 4 weeks, with about 2 to 3 times weekly, can have a mood lifting effect, especially for people who might be pregnant and can't take their medications right now, or for people who medications just have not worked. This is typically not your first line of defense. This may be, again, if medications aren't working or you have special circumstances, as it can cause some issues like memory loss over long-term use. However, again, another good option for someone who's really struggling and needs that help. Maybe I can't do it without it. And then the baby of the family, you might have heard some radio commercials about TMS treatment. These are high-power magnets that have a similar effect like the ECT does, where with several treatments over the course of several weeks can have a mood-lifting effect. Again, I know there's a whole lot of information up there that I'm kind of paraphrasing, but typically treatments are about 20 to 40 minutes, 5 days a week for 6 weeks. So a pretty intensive course. This may be, again, where if someone needs a ride to their treatment, it could be a big help to kind of break that among our church group. And the last one is hospitalization. Sometimes this is absolutely needed. If I can't keep myself safe, if the depression has gotten to a point where I cannot be safe with myself, or if I'm adjusting my meds and I have a history of having really strong reactions to my meds, either positive or negative, someone may be hospitalized for a brief period of time to kind of help keep them safe or to help monitor that medication change to make sure that they stay safe on that change. And typically this can be as short as 24 to 48 hours. Average is 1 to 2 weeks, depending on the reason for admission. Can be up to 30 days, and sometimes it's longer if it's a severe and persistent mental health issue that maybe they just are chronically unsafe. So, big question I know a lot of people are here for is how can I help? Do's and don'ts. We've already covered a few of these. Not trying to fix it for someone, not trying to give services you're not qualified for, but instead, top right, I love this phrase, listen. And I said, God gave us a great hint. How many ears do we have? How many mouths do we have? That's a suggestion. Listening at least twice as much as we're speaking and not offering advice. There's so many shoulds in this world, but instead listening to what the needs are and sometimes maybe encouragement. You know, it sounds like that might be something to really talk to a professional about. Have you thought about that? Also, not minimizing struggles. So, you're just depressed. Okay, you just have hypertension. Both of these things can be small or big, depending on where you're at. So instead, recognizing how hard the simple thing can be. For some people, getting out of bed and putting my feet on the floor is the biggest thing I've done all week. And not minimizing that of like, I do that every day. Yeah. But not without the anchor that is depression tied to your back. Another thing is not telling someone all those lovely first slide things of toughen up, man up, but instead offering empowering encouragement. You know, okay, you got out of bed today. I'm going to celebrate with you in that. Good for you, because I know how hard that is with depression. Not gossiping, but respecting confidentiality. Just because I told you I have depression doesn't mean I want the entire women's group, the entire church council, the world to know. You know, unless it's on my public profile on Facebook, you know, that may not be something I want to share with anyone. And even then, that's for friends. So also not telling what treatment they should do. So if they choose counseling, if they choose medication, whatever they choose, support that. Because maybe counseling was the best thing in my life, but for someone else that may not be so. And also not trying to be a professional if you aren't one. I know I say that a few times, and in my case, even though I am a professional, not for my friends and family. You need to go talk to someone who's unbiased, because I am not unbiased with my friends and family. I have an opinion about what you should do. So you need to go see someone. So instead, knowing your local resources and trying to encourage people maybe to follow up with that. So a little bit about some of those services. Most, in fact, all areas in Virginia have what's called a CSB, Community Services Board, that typically provides mental health services, either counseling, medication, substance abuse resources and treatment, and sometimes even for our littles, so infant and child resources. Everyone has a CSB, and if you go on vacsb.org, you can look up your local one based on your zip code. There's also the National Suicide Hotline, and we have a whole lot of cards that have that number all over it on this table, as well as magnets, brochures. That's great for if someone is struggling, having a place to call, someone to talk to figure out what's next. And of course, police and 911. Sometimes this is necessary. Sometimes people are not in their safe place. In Virginia, there's some special training called CIT, Crisis Intervention Trained Officers. These individuals have had to go through a big course on how to handle mental health. They have talked to individuals with mental health issues and the people treating it. And so if you did have to call the police because someone is unsafe, you may be making that request of, and if you can, please send a CIT trained officer, because this is a mental health thing. And again, this may be the right number to call if someone is actively endangering their life, if they have picked up a weapon, if they are doing a bizarre behavior. So like maybe I'm not saying I want to kill myself, but I'm laying on a dotted line on a busy road. Okay, it might be time to call for some help here. And again, when to call: suicidal, homicidal, endangering their health, bizarre behaviors that could endanger their health. If I haven't ate for several days, what's going to happen if I keep not eating or drinking? This may be endangering my health. That may be a time to call. And when in doubt, if you're not sure, call and they can tell you if you're the one they need to be calling. So what can our church do? Talk about it. What you're doing today is one of the big things. Just breaking the stigma. Our morning prayer. We pray for all those who are in the hospital. We pray for those struggling with health conditions, both physical and mental. Tiny little change that lets that person who maybe drugged themselves out of bed this morning, it was the bravest thing they could do to put on the dirty jeans from yesterday and get in the back pew. But we prayed for them today, and they heard it when we said physical and mental health issues. There are also a number of various months of remembrance for various mental health things. You can find this list online if you just type in like mental health month. It'll bring up a whole lot of different options. And so it might be that, in May, it's mental health month. So maybe that's part of our morning announcements one week. And again, many more things. StampOutStigma.com has a large list of options too to help break that stigma. Also, depending on what the need is, like the church that I came out of has a few different support groups that borrow a room once or twice a week to where they can have their meetings. So like AA, NA, NAMI. Maybe we offer them a space to where they can meet. You might have a binder of local resources. So just, hey, a lot of times, who do people come to first? It's not me. It's their pastor. It's their deacon. So maybe we keep a binder in the church office of various resources, food pantries, counselors, local hospitals. Who is our CSB anyhow? You can also put up posters about postpartum depression if you have a nursery. Because again, maybe the mom doesn't want to tell anyone. I'm having a really hard time connecting with my baby, and I don't actually want to be here anymore, not just in this building, but I want to be here. But that poster may tell her, hey, Postpartum Virginia, resources for people who feel just like you. Sometimes we're not going to ask, but if we have the stuff on the walls, it lets people help themselves. And again, you heard me talk about NAMI, N-A-M-I. I love that group. Shout out to anyone who actually sees this. And SAMHSA provided all the materials on this table that came from my side. They will send you free stuff. If you want those little suicide hotline cards, they'd be happy to mail it to you for free. They have a lot of great resources and articles. And the Virginia Department of Behavioral Health, again, has a lot of resources on their website. You heard me talk about Postpartum Support Virginia and Stamp Out Stigma earlier. And both have great resources, great outreach. So again, I know I threw a lot of information at y'all this morning, but thank you for hearing it. I hope that this will help you either help yourself or help someone in your life or both. And please ask me questions whenever you have them, okay? And Laura, I believe we're about to do a break, right?
So we're going to do a break for about 10 minutes if you need to use the ladies' room or stretch your legs, and we'll be back. Thank you, Sarah. talk with us about a little bit more about anxiety and depression and suicide prevention.
Oh, good morning. This is the first time in a very long time that I've had to talk on a microphone. I'm usually sitting, I'm a teacher, and so with COVID, I have been literally sitting in front of my computer talking to my computer screen. So it's actually nice to see people in general. So have you guys had anything to be anxious about in the last, 12 to 18 months or anything like that? Just checking. What are some of the things, I'm a teacher, like I said, so it's a little bit participatory. What are some of the things that you personally have been anxious about? What are some things that have just like, not getting to see grandkids or family, okay? People that won't take the vaccine, absolutely. Our safety, absolutely. How many of you guys panicked last year when we had the toilet paper shortage? Or, I didn't panic because I'm just one of these people, I don't hoard things. But walking into the grocery store and like seeing those empty shelves and like going, okay, well, I'm down to my last 4 rolls. When am I going to get some more? Or cleaning products. What has been the most recent thing that has given us anxiety besides gasoline? I was like, thanks. The gasoline issue, yes. So in the past 18 months, I would have to say that the majority of us have experienced some type of anxiety in some way. So I know that as a teacher, school, just the unknown, that has been like a huge thing. And then opening schools back up. How do we do it safely? And do I really want to be a teacher any longer? Because I don't really think I want to come back and have children sneezing on me and things like that. And so there has been so much anxiety and so many things for us to be anxious about in the last 18 months that I don't think anybody has come out of this unscathed. So I'm going to talk to you about a little bit about anxiety and about suicide prevention because it's very important. And one of the things that I always mention when I do this, I am not a professional. I am a high school teacher. I teach history, and this year English 12, and EPF, which is economics and personal finance, U.S. history and government. So I picked up 2 new subjects, so I was a little anxious about those things as well. And so I'm not a professional. I'm just a layperson who really has a passion for people with mental illness, because one of the things I noticed when I moved from the elementary school to the high school is that a lot of our students in high school are do have mental illness, all different types of things, but if they don't have mental illness, maybe they're taking care of a parent who has experienced that as well. So I just have this like burning passion for those people. So I am not, like I said, not a professional. I'm a professional teacher, not a professional diagnostic. So any type of mental illness that we are talking about, like depression and anxiety and Alzheimer's, has to have a medical diagnosis. So if you have any questions about it, things like if you're experiencing symptoms or you know somebody is experiencing symptoms, don't self-diagnose. See your general physician, go and see a medical doctor so that they can diagnose you with that. So my verse that I hold on to is 1 Peter 5:7, and it says, "Cast all your anxiety on God because He cares for you." And that's been like a wonderful thing this year, is to know that God is in control of this whole crazy world. God is in control. And when I'm anxious, I can go to God. All right. So anxiety disorders, what is it? It is, I should have mentioned, my entire presentation is on that sheet of paper that Sarah handed out. It's like the 2-sided page. Yeah. So we'll talk through it. And if there's mistakes on it, please forgive me. I was monitoring an SOL while I was typing this. So wasn't supposed to be, but whatever. So you got to do what you got to do. So mental health, it's a mental health disorder that is characterized by feelings of worry, anxiety, or fear that is strong enough to interfere with your daily life. This is something that is seriously going to mess up your day. You are so anxious that you cannot function. And most of the examples I'm going to use are going to be with my students because I'm not going to give names, so I'm going to describe some of the things. I work with a young lady who has severe anxiety, to the point that I have never ever seen somebody that has this. We're trying to get her back in school because we're doing that hybrid thing, and next year we're going to go full. And just getting her in the building for one class, for 1 hour a week, has proven to be almost difficult, because she starts thinking about it, and then she gets very anxious, and she throws up, and then she has headaches and things like that. So our young kids are dealing with a lot as well. And so it totally interrupts her life. She really doesn't have a life because she can't make it out the door because she's so anxious. So when anxiety starts to interrupt your life, then that's when you need to see a physician. And going back to with what Sarah said, it's like that 2-week thing. So if you're having that anxiety for like longer than 2 weeks, or you're noticing somebody's having it, that's when you need to seek medical attention. Like I said, all of us have had anxiety this year about one thing or another, and that's normal. But when it's really disrupting your life is when you need to do it. So anxiety, one of the things that you see is going to have like stress that is out of proportion to the impact of the event. So if you're completely stressing over something that is fairly insignificant might be to others, but you're so enthralled and so wrapped up in that you can't move on, then that is it's not equal. I will give you my example, and I like totally laughed at myself because like the day later I'm like, oh my gosh, Antila, you're just so stupid. Why did you do this? So this year, during COVID, I have, and you may do this too, I have discovered a show that I really, really liked. And so I started watching the show, I got really involved in it, and this past season was coming on, and I was like in like 3 or 4 Facebook groups about the show, and everybody's like analyzing and diagnosing the show and like breaking it down. And so we had the new season. It ended on, thank gosh, it ended on Sunday. But I would get so anxious and so wound up with the show. Like after the show was over on Sunday night, I couldn't sleep because I'm thinking about the show. And then I would think about the show all week long, and like I wanted it to turn out the way I wanted it to turn out, and it didn't turn out the way I wanted it to turn out. And I would find myself getting like just like tensed up in my heart, then like Sunday was like the countdown to the show. And then when it ended, and it didn't end the way I wanted it to, I literally sat there and cried. And like was just so distressed and despondent, because I allowed my anxieties to feed into that show, and let that be like for like the last 12 weeks something that I was completely focused on. And I have no control over a TV show. I have no idea. I just don't. But that was my experience with anxiety in the last couple weeks, and I would talk about it. I'm obsessive over it and all that good stuff. So some of the different symptoms, you can get fatigued, like you just are so tired that you just, because it takes a lot of energy if you're anxious, to look like you're normal, and like suppressing those anxieties. And so you get really tired, you get really irritable, and so, we all get irritable at some point, but like this is like a constant irritability. You have those racing thoughts, you can't shut it off. Like when you lay down at night to go to sleep and your brain just like is on fire, and it just keeps going and going and going and going, and it just won't shut off. You have feelings of impending doom, that something as bad is going to happen. Regardless of what you do, something bad is going to happen. Sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. You might also have nausea, or even throwing up. When you have children, this is something that you need to pay attention to. If your child is feeling nauseous every single morning before school, that means they probably have some type of anxiety. It's not morning sickness, they're not pregnant, but they might have some type of anxiety going to school. Even adults have that. Several years ago, I do a lot of co-teaching, and I was asked to co-teach with a teacher who, my first year, she was like all the way down the hall from my classroom, but I could hear her yelling at her kids. And like everybody could hear it, and she was very explosive and very angry. And I was assigned to teach a class with her. And I was just like, oh, is not going to be good. Plus, it was in the I mean, I'm a history person, and it was an English class, and I had first block planning. And I can tell you, every morning, and we teach every other day together, every morning when I would drive to work, I would just have like this feeling of impending doom that I was going into this classroom with this teacher. It was just one class. And then I would literally spend my first block planning either being very nauseous or being sick to my stomach before I went and taught this class. And that is anxiety. I mean, that is like some serious anxiety. My brother, all the way through middle school, literally threw up every day before he had to go to school. So that is something that when you have children, that if your child is nauseous or sick all the time, that is a huge indicator that they're probably anxious about something and they just can't say it out loud. Poor concentration. This means you just can't think through things. I know that we were talking in the car on the way up, and I was talking to Kathy over here. This year, I mean, I can't remember anything. I mean, I've been anxious a lot because of COVID, but, you know, people who normally don't have anxiety are just having a real hard time concentrating on things. I mean, like doing the things that they normally do because of what we've been through for the last year and a half. So if you have like really poor concentration skills, like you keep reading that same page over and over in your book, or you read a chapter in your book and then you go back the next night to read the chapter, but then you really can't remember what the book is about, so you have to go back and read the chapter before to remember what. So that's like sometimes that's normal, but if you're a person who normally doesn't have that, poor concentration. And I think I meant to say this earlier. Anxiety comes along. It can be its own illness in itself, but it also comes along with things like ADHD, the depression and stuff like that, with dementia. So it can also coincide with another mental illness as well. When your heart is racing, like to a point that you feel like you're having a heart attack, I mean, it's just pounding out of your chest. You have chest pains, you're having difficulty breathing, and sometimes it does act like a heart attack, and so you don't know if you're having an anxiety attack or a heart attack. So when in doubt, if you're having those feelings, go to the hospital, and they can let you know. Then they can do the testing and the diagnostics to let you know it's just an anxiety attack, this is what you need to do, or you're really having a heart attack. So those are things to pay attention to. So we have a couple anxiety disorders. The first one and the most common is called GAD, which is General Anxiety Disorder. And it's just like, you're just worried about everything. I mean, like anything and everything you can think about, you're going to potentially worry about it. I'll use an example with my mother. Bless her soul. She is undiagnosed, I believe, with anxiety. And my sister's in town, and so she went and got her COVID shot yesterday. And so we had been planning this for about a month to get her the Johnson & Johnson's COVID shot because of different things. And like, so she's been talking about it. She's been very anxious. My sister takes her yesterday, and my sister says before they left, my mother had to show her all the places where all the different papers were and where the will was and things like that. And then all the way over to get the COVID shot, she was just absolutely positive she was going to die. I mean, absolutely positive. And we're like, no, we've researched this. We've talked to your doctors. You're okay. So that is like anxiety. So we have our older adults who may not be taking the vaccination because they do have anxiety about like what's going to happen. And that's normal. I mean, they worry about the money, they worry about the health, they worry about their children, they worry about school, they worry about work. And then you have your social phobias, which is like the little girl I described who basically has agoraphobia. Is that it? The one where they can't come out of the house? Where they're so anxious about getting at the what ifs of if I leave my house, what if, to the point that they can't leave their house. And then you also have your other ones like fear of snakes, which is logical, but like it's like a chronic fear of snakes, or you have your arachnophobias and things like that. So there's things that you're afraid of heights, and those all fall under your anxiety disorders. You also have OCD, and that is where those people who have, and it's a compulsion and you cannot stop it, you have to do it. It might be like, switching, like checking the lock like 5 or 6 times at night to make sure that it is, but you have to do it before you go to bed, and if you don't do it, then you're going to sit there and think about it all night long because you didn't check it. You only checked it 4 times, not 5 times, and you need to go back and do it. The ones that repeatedly wash their hands a lot because it's not clean to the point that their hands are bleeding because they've washed their hands so much. So like having those repetitive rituals that you have to do, like getting in the car, you have to go through a certain pattern. And if you don't go through that certain pattern, you have to get back out of the car and do it again. So that is OCD. And it's like, again, it's something that takes over your life. It's a compulsion. You can't stop it. You have to do it. You'll also see a lot of anxiety that comes with PTSD. And it's not just with our military people, but anybody who experiences PTSD could potentially have the anxiety disorder with it. PTSD is one of the mental health illnesses that is not a biological or a chemical thing. It is something that has happened. It's an event, and it can be for a couple months or it can be lifelong, depending on that. And there will be a lot of anxiety that comes along with that. So we talked about anxiety and COVID. I've spent a lot of time by myself this year, so had a lot of time to think. One of the words that would like make me anxious is unprecedented times. How many times have you heard that? We're living in unprecedented times. Well, I don't want to live in unprecedented times. I want to live in precedented times. I don't want to be making history. So those are things. I talked about the lack of TP. Just the information overload has caused anxiety. It's on, you go on Facebook, you go on social media, it's on the computer, it's on the radio, it's on TV. So just having that. And now we're dealing a lot with COVID fatigue. We're in this 18 months, now we're tired, but we're anxious like, what is the next step? And, do we go back to church? And you're talking about vaccinations. Who has the vaccinations? Who doesn't? Do I need to wear a pin that says, it's just seasonal allergies, I don't have COVID, or I have my shots? So there's just like all that anxiety going on. So we'll go back to that, some positive coping skills, because I do want to talk to you a bit about suicide before my time runs out. Suicide can come from depression, and it can come from anxiety. And there's 3 different types of, not types of suicide, but different ways that you can think about it. The first one is a suicide ideation. That means you are thinking about it, talking about it, considering it, or you're planning it, but you're not at the point where you're going to do it. Then you have the suicide attempt. And that is where a suicide attempt is a non-fatal, but it's a self-directed harm, which is potentially going to injure you, but the intent is you want to die. And that is where you are. And you may attempt suicide, but you may not die from that, or you might not have a result of an injury or anything like that. But then you have suicide, and this is death. This is a completion of death. It's a self-directed, injurious behavior with the intent to die with this behavior. And it is a huge health concern. It is a major health concern. And this is something that I see pretty much on a daily basis and have seen since I moved to the high school in 2007, which is one of the reasons I became very interested in mental health. 45,000 people die in the U.S. every year by suicide. More than that make attempts, but 45,000 do. It's the leading cause of death between people ages 10 to 34. Fourth leading cause between the ages of 35 and 54. And what age group do you think also has a really, really high rate of suicide? Seniors, and especially senior men, those who have retired. So I know that like with COVID, we've had more people contemplating suicide because of the isolation and things like that. And so we have had an upward swing of suicide and self-injurious behaviors. So it is when somebody is talking about suicide or talking about killing themselves or talking about just self-injury, this is not like, oh, an attention getter. This is like, you need to stop and like literally listen to this person and this is a cry for help. And it can't be ignored. As a teacher, I am a state mandated reporter. So if a student in my classroom says, even in joking, oh, well, I'll just go out and kill myself as a joke, I have to report that. Because if I don't, then I get in trouble. And what happens if it's true? He says it, he said it jokingly, and then 4 days later he goes out and completes suicide. So this is something that you need to pay attention to when people are talking about it, because it is a very serious thing for them to do. Some of the risk factors we talked about are like substance abuse, chronic pain, being in jail or prison, and then being released from jail or prison. Because like if you've been in there for a long period of time, you may not know how to navigate it. And if you've been in there for 20 years, this world has changed a lot in the 20 years that you've been incarcerated. And how do you come back in? And how do you relate to your family and your friends? And how do you get a job and things like that? We talked about the COVID isolation, remote learning. Oh my Lord, I can tell you so much about remote learning, and how much that is impacting our children's mental health. I think in years down the line, probably not even a year down the line, we're going to have a lot of children who are in this situation with remote learning or hybrid learning or whatever, who are going to have serious mental illnesses because of what we've gone through in the last year and a half. If there's a family history of suicide, if the children are seeing it glamorized, like if their favorite TV star or musician or something like commits suicide, then it's publicized, it seems very glamorous way to die, and they'll do that. Another one that we see is cyberbullying. A lot of that happens, and I'll tell you a story about a student in a minute about cyberbullying. And then people over the age of 60 or 65, there's particularly men who are completely defined all their life by their work history, and all of a sudden they're forced to retire, and they don't know what to do. They feel useless. And so sometimes you will see that as well with older people when they retire. So a couple warning signs that are on there. If they're talking about it, and if a lot of people have that false sense of thinking like, well, if I talk to them about it, then it's going to make them commit suicide. Usually the opposite is true. If you talk to somebody who is thinking about suicide, you might be that person that has intervened and has made them stop and think about it, and that lets them know that you care. So it usually does have the opposite effect if you talk to them about, are you thinking about killing yourself? And it's just as easy as that sometimes, and it's kind of awkward, but you might get like, the floodgates might open, and then you might save a life. If they're searching for things online, if they're stockpiling pills, buying guns, or moving guns from a safe place to a more accessible place. Let's see. So methods, most common is firearms. That is, if you want to complete suicide, that is what you're going to do, is you're going to use a firearm, and it's going to be mainly men over women who will choose that. Then you have the others. Women will probably do something a little bit less violent, with like suffocation, like where they go in the car, in the garage, and they put the hose to the exhaust pipe and put the hose into the car and die that way. Hanging is another one. We work out on Standing Rock Reservation during the summertime, and that is usually the what they choose to do to commit suicide. And so that's one of the reasons, like when I pack up the vans and things like that, we take out everything, like any type of rope, jump ropes or anything like that, because we don't want to give them the means to do that. You also have drug overdose, things like that. And just to wrap up, every 15 minutes, somebody in this United States dies by their own hand, by suicide. If they're a vet, 22 vets per day kill themselves, and that equals up to about 80,000 vets per year. Sarah talked about getting hope. There's help. There is listed on the page that she handed out to you. Suicide prevention lines to call 911 if needed. But I really want to close very quickly with a story about a little boy who, from our school system. I work in a very small school system, and his name is Matthew, and he committed suicide a week after his 14th birthday. He was in the 8th grade. And one of the things that I've heard over and over again, is that he always had a smile on his face. He was always the first one with a joke. He was always the first one to help. He was like the most loving kid, and he always had a smile on his face. And even his parents said that. And so if there is, and they also said that he was a very strong person. So during this time period as church members, if you know that really strong person that always has a smile on their face and things like that, on the surface it looks okay, but maybe on the inside it's not, check on those people. Talk to those people. The person I always think about is Robin Williams, who is a fantastic comic, and he committed suicide. He always had a smile on his face. He was always quick with a joke, but he also was dealing with a lot of things inside. So make sure you check on those people who say that they're strong, because they're strong on the outside, but they may not be so on the inside. And I think Kathy is up to talk about grief. So such uplifting topics.
Thank you, Auntie O.
Okay, take a deep breath for a moment. Well, I wasn't doing it for that reason, but these are heavy topics we are dealing with, aren't they? And when you hear about a child feeling like just so hopeless that they have to commit, So I just wanted us to just breathe. And the scripture that I thought about as I was preparing to talk about grief, again, another heavy topic, is Matthew 11:28, where Jesus said, "Come unto me, all ye who are weary, and I will give you rest." In the darkest of times, we know that we have God with us, don't we? And we know that Jesus cares, and Jesus showed how to care for others. And so we can always turn to our faith. But that is something that we need to remember when people are in those darkest of times. Sometimes they've forgotten that. And it can be a simple thing like us reaching out in love to help them feel God's love. So that's why we're here, so that we can know how to share the love of God with other people in those dark, dark times and share rejoicing in the happy times. So we've been talking a little bit about COVID, and we certainly don't want to dwell on everything we've been through. But for just a second, as we're thinking of grief, I want you to think about in your life, what are 3 things that you have lost this year because of COVID? Just think about it. I'll begin by sharing one thing, and again, they're not in order of significance, but just for all of us, we've lost a lot of freedom, haven't we? Freedom of movement, freedom to go and do what we want to do when we feel like doing it. My husband retired last July, and I had retired a little bit earlier, and we thought when he retired that we would go on a trip, that we had hoped to travel around the country visiting friends, and whoops, can't do that. So what are some of the things that you guys may have lost, if you feel like sharing one thing? Anybody want to share something? Doesn't have to be the deepest, darkest thing, but just... I heard about that, and I'm so, so sorry. Yes, many of us have experienced the grief of losing a friend or a family member to the disease. So that is certainly the most significant loss, I think, of what's... And when you think of how many people in our country have died, I mean, that's staggering. Truly, truly staggering. So I'm very thankful to God that we've got a vaccine. We're headed in the right direction. So, other losses that you might have experienced, anybody? You couldn't do it. Yeah. 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 That's a huge loss. You know, if you're a huggy person, or even if you're not, with your family members you usually are, but not to be able to see those people or embrace them when you see them, to have to stand 6 feet away and wear a mask. Yes, just that has been very, very isolating. Have y'all felt isolated somewhat too, in the grief of that, not being able to, maybe you have someone who's been in the hospital, or someone who's been in a long-term care or nursing care facility, and you couldn't visit. And just so many different losses, and there are folks who've lost their jobs, folks who've lost homes because they've lost their job. I mean, there are just so many layers of loss. And so what do we do with that grief? Well, let's talk for a minute about what grief is. And I want you to tell me if this is a true or false, and you can just say true or false, and it doesn't matter if we're right or wrong. Grief is the emotional reaction to loss. Mourning is how we express our grief. Do you think that's true? So when we have loss, we grieve. Usually. And grieving is called mourning. You're mourning something that you lost. Do you think it's true or false that grief is unavoidable and universal? You think that's true? Some point in our life we all grieve something. So it's a pretty universal thing. That we don't have a lot of things that we can say everyone in this world shares. But grief is one of them. Another is change. And with change comes loss, quite often. And with loss comes grief. So the way that people grieve are as diverse as there are people. What do you think? Absolutely. We don't all grieve alike. And we have to recognize that. Because if we don't recognize it, what happens? We're disappointed in other people. We have expectations that Jane should be crying all the time about her mother's death. And maybe she's not. Maybe she's not showing it to us. Maybe she does it in private. You know, so we can have expectations of other people that then lead to judgment. And so we have to realize that everyone grieves differently. Do you think that the level of grief that a person experiences always matches the loss that they've had? No. So by that I mean someone may have a pet who is like a child to them. And so their grief for that pet is very deep, isn't it? And it may appear to be deeper than when they lost their sister who lived a long way away and they didn't see very often. And you might think, oh gosh, she grieved more for her dog. Again, are we the judge of how and why people grieve the way they do? No. So we always need to keep that in mind. We all grieve differently. The grief process changes from day to day. What do you think? Those of us that have grieved, do you always feel the same each day about your loss? No. And over time, you know, people, that's not a good thing to say to someone who's grieving. Time heals all things. You know, you don't. But for those of us that have grieved, we probably do feel that after 10 years, we may grieve our mom's loss a little bit less than we did the day after she died. But maybe we still grieve. We still experience that. But also, I don't know about you guys, but grief changes. I can, in the beginning it's so intense, and then as it goes along, there may be a song that comes on the radio, and it takes you right back to that deep grief. Have you ever had that happen? Or it could be a scent, a smell. Like you could walk into your mom might have always made a certain kind of cookie, and you walk into a place and it smells like that, and you immediately are drawn back to that grief. You know, so there are changes in how we grieve, and that's okay. So I want to talk for a minute about things that can complicate grief. You may have had, COVID year, for example, has complicated grief because we've had so many different layers of grief and so much unknown, like Antioch was talking about. There are just all kinds of grief we've been dealing with. But complicated grief and cumulative losses, I'll tell you about a day on February 13th in 2013. My daughter had just been diagnosed with lymphoma. She was 28. And we were taking her that day for chemo, her first chemo treatment. So my husband and I had decided we would take turns because only one could go back. And that's another loss in COVID. Think about all the people who couldn't go to treatments with their family members. Whew. So my husband decided we decided he would go with her to the first, and I would go to work. And so I had decided to go by the Y and do some cycling before I went to work. And while I'm sitting there on cycling, I get a call from my husband. Well, I knew he was with her, getting her treatment. I thought, oh gosh, something might be wrong. I answered the phone, and he said, I just got a call from my in-laws, lived in a retirement community. He had just gotten a call from the retirement community that his dad had died. Now he's at the hospital with her in the chemo treatment. His dad just died. I'm riding a bike. And I went, he didn't want to leave her to go to his mom, has serious dementia. I mentioned that earlier. So she was not knowing what to do, what was going on. She was all anxious. So I said, let me get off the bike. I'll come to you so you can leave and go to your mom. And all of that happened when we had just moved the week before to a new house. Now that's complicated grief. And I bet in your life you have had times of complicated grief where it's like there are layers of things happening all at once. And you can hardly grieve for one thing because there's so many different things going on at one time. When things like that happen in your life, do you think that your grief is shortened or lengthened? Yes. Then you move into prolonged grief because there was just so much that you kind of grieve each loss when you can. I even talked to my daughter the other day. I was telling her about coming here and about talking about grief, and I told her I was going to share that day that was just so awful in her life. And she said, I don't think I've ever grieved for Papa the way I should, because she was in the middle of her treatment. Whew. It was something. So when things like that happen, it can lead people to, when things are so compounded, it can lead to all kinds of complications. Like people can feel so overwhelmed by all that's going on that they might shut down. They might get very angry and do something self-destructive. They might turn to alcohol or drugs or something else unhealthy. So that kind of grief is very complicated, and quite often you need to get help, don't you, to get through things like that. And that's one thing I want to always encourage people. Don't be afraid to seek help. If you need it, you need to talk to somebody, find out from friends. You might get some resources of a good person they may have talked with. But don't be afraid when so much is going on in your life to realize, I just can't handle all this. I just need a little help. There's another kind of grief that quite often people experience called anticipatory grief, where you're anxious about what you feel like is coming. Have you ever felt like the other shoe's going to drop? Mm-hmm. And so you're living in kind of an anxiety, like Antio was talking about, of what's going to happen next. Your spouse may have been diagnosed with a form of cancer or heart disease or something, and you've heard from other people this prognosis, this is what might happen, this is what might happen, this is what, and so then you start fixating on the what ifs that are coming, and it's hard to live your life because you're so focused on the grief of what comes next. So that's when you anticipate grief. And prolonged grief, another example of prolonged grief is Alzheimer's or dementia, when you know this person is going to be a long process for them. And so you grieve the long process that it will be. And the loss is gradual, isn't it, over the years when someone has dementia, or when someone has, say, chronic obstructive pulmonary, COPD, or some disease that takes a long time. It's a prolonged grief. And quite often, we think that when a family has dealt with something for a long time, when the death actually happens, we think, oh, it won't be hard on them because they will have been grieving all these years. Is that true? Heck no. Because that's final. That's the final thing. You realize you're not going to be with that person anymore. So we have to recognize that. People are going to continue to grieve, and it's okay. So what do you think are some of the physical signs of grief? What do you notice when you're grieving? Are there anything physical happen to you when you're grieving? Loss of appetite is a big one. Some people eat more. right. You kind of isolate, or you're really thinking a lot and processing, and so you just kind of back away from some social engagements. You're not as involved maybe in things as you used to be. Other kind of physical things you might feel. Tired. You might feel tired a whole lot, really exhausted, have difficulty sleeping. You could even get sick, physically sick from grief. There is something called broken heart syndrome. Have y'all heard of that? Where a couple may have been together 60 years or a long, long time, and they don't know how to function without the other. And so quite often when an elder dies, their spouse may die not too long after that because of that severe grief. Some of the social things that might happen when you're grieving, we already mentioned the isolation. You kind of withdraw into yourself and cut yourself off from things. You may become just so angry that it becomes hard for people to be around you because of your anger or your despair or feeling hopeless. So there are lots of emotions that come with grief. Confusion, I think you mentioned the confusion that can come too when things are going on, so much is going on, you just, oh no, I guess it was Antiola that mentioned it, you might lose track of dates or things that you had planned, and you just totally forget because you just have confusion that comes with grief, and that's okay. Can you think of any spiritual problems that might exist because of grief? Blaming God, yes, blaming God for what happened. If it a traumatic death or a prolonged illness and then death, yeah, sometimes people blame God. Do we need to allow them to say that? Yes, yes. And not to feel guilty for saying that. God can handle anger. God can handle frustration. God can handle confusion. Who did we get this body from? I mean, God created us and gave us these emotions. And the Bible mentions on so many different occasions to be not afraid. If you think about it, sometimes you should just look up all the I did that one time. I just looked to see how many passages there were, and it's dozens of passages that tell us not to be afraid, that God will be with us. So I would like for you to hand out, there's this couple of sheets that I want to give out to you. And we're not going to go down them, but I want you to have these for your resources. I'm just going to highlight some of the things. And for those of you who are watching, these sheets are available here at church. I'll leave them. So if someone was watching and wanted to get a sheet, then they would have access to it. The first one is appropriate expectations in grief. You have that one. And again, I'm not going to go over it, but I want you to just take that home. So right now we're just going to talk about some of the things you might expect with grief. You can expect, as we were talking about, that grief is very personal. It's going to be different for each person, and that's fine. They need to feel the way they feel. The people that grieve, it used to be that there were time limits put on grief. Now, some of us are old enough to remember that you always used to wear black. Many of you may have watched the movie Gone with the Wind. Did you see the movie Gone with the Wind? Okay. And there was a part in which Scarlett O'Hara lost her husband, who it was questionable about whether she really cared a heck of a lot for him, but she was wearing black, and she went to a ball, and she's standing behind a booth, and they're playing music, and she's tapping her toes, and she really wants to get out there and dance. But you're not supposed to because you're in mourning. And they used to have a time limit for mourning, didn't they? So it's like you would wear black for a year. And at the end of that year, you're supposed to be fine. Does that happen? No. We cannot put a time limitation on grief. You have the right, again, to feel what you feel and to express it. So when we're visiting people who are grieving, we need to know that it's okay for them to share whatever they're feeling. And initially, they may not share. So what do we need to be? Present. Present. Just to be there. So that they know someone's going to be with them. I found, when you've been going through grief personally, have you found that just having someone there is comforting? Whether they say anything or not? I know when my mom died, my best friend from Florida came up and she did all these background things that I wasn't even aware she was doing. I mean, she was cleaning the kitchen, she was cooking food, she did things that I just didn't have the energy or the, couldn't do, but she's back there doing that. So we need to allow people to feel what they need to feel and to not judge that and to respect it going on, not for a length of time, but for whatever time that person needs. But we also need to recognize that if grief is prolonged, like we were talking before, and very complicated, there may come a time when a person really needs to seek help, really needs to talk with someone, when that grief has gotten to a point where it's compromising their ability to live, when they can't function, they can't go to work, they can't take care of their family, they can't find joy in life, and they may have entered into that depression that the others were talking about, then perhaps we could quietly say, might be a good time to talk with someone. And again, you can even offer, can I go with you the first time to meet? Because sometimes having someone go can help them have the courage to do that. So we do need to get to a point where we might recommend that they talk with someone. The other page that I handed out, and there are more examples, I'm not going to talk about all of them, but you can read through that page and see the other examples of expectations of grief. But one thing I have found when I'm grieving a person, and I just am having a hard time, I wish that I had more time to tell them I wish I'd been able to tell them one more thing or talk to them about one more thing. I have found this sheet that I gave you. It's kind of a little exercise that I have done from time to time on my own. I don't ever do this in a group and have people share because these are personal. And again, for those of you that are watching, you can get this sheet from church. And it's a sheet where you go down, it says, you are gone now, but our relationship remains etched in my memory. A few final thoughts. And it allows you to just think of things that you appreciate about that person, things that they meant to you, what you liked about your relationship. You can even have a chance to write down maybe something that you didn't like. And we all in relationships may have those little things that were kind of irksome. Now that we can no longer meet, I will miss doing this with you. I have found that doing this exercise helps me to process when someone has died. And because I've worked in hospice and long-term care for 25 years, do you think I've experienced a lot of losses? Yes. And even though those folks were not relatives, they grew to be friends. And I cared for them. And at one facility that I worked in for 10 years. And so I was with people when they first moved in, and then I was with them when they died. And so for caregivers, whether you are a paid caregiver or a person just loving that person and visiting, we grieve too. And you need a chance to express that grief. And so this little exercise here can give you a chance just to write down some thoughts, kind of a saying goodbye and a saying thank you. Because grief it's important. It's very, very important to go through the grieving process and to know that that is a part of healing, is grieving. And eventually, as you grieve and as you go through the process, you will come to a time when you get to a new normal. Things will never be the same because you've lost that person from your life. They'll never be like it was, but it can still be good, and it can still be hopeful, and you'll move into a new phase of life. But it takes time. I love this quote that's from a rabbi. His name is David Walt, and he wrote a book called Making Loss Matter. And this is what he says. What loss cries out for is not to be fixed or explained, but to be shared, and eventually to find its way into meaning. I love that. So grief does not cry out to be fixed. We don't need someone to come in and feel like they can fix how we're feeling. We just need to share it, and they need to honor it, and then eventually we'll have new meaning and new life. So I want you to know that as you walk with grief, or as you walk with those who are grieving, just take the love of God with you and take the love of Christ that he showed as he grieved with many people as he was ministering. We have examples, and we know that God is with us at all times. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. We're going to take just a minute to stand up and stretch. We're going to have another bathroom break in a few minutes, but if y'all just want to stand up and stretch and kind of get those kinks out and roll your shoulders, do whatever kind of things you need to just get, if we were kids, I'd say get the wiggles out, but it may be the aches and the pains for us, right? So get those aches and pains out. All right, everybody good? Yeah? Okay. All right. Make sure this is on, and that's rolling. I introduced myself earlier. My name is Laura, and I actually have the pleasure of being able to coordinate this team. Aren't they amazing? Just an incredible amount of knowledge and passion and expertise. They're just wonderful, wonderful ladies. So I have the pleasure of being able to coordinate the teams. If you have an organization, or if you're not from this church, you're from another church, and you would like this team to come, or the domestic violence team, domestic violence awareness team, or the human trafficking awareness team, please just let me know, and I would be glad to make that happen. We also can do virtual. That's what we've been doing the last year. So just wanted to let you all know that. I am actually going to be sharing with you ways that you can be involved in mental health ministry in your church. You've heard quite a bit already today. In each presentation there was a little bit, and so some of it is going to be a little bit of a repeat, but some of it will be new as well. Kay Warren, some of you all have heard about her. She describes herself as an author, a speaker, an advocate, and a pastor's wife. She and her husband, Rick Warren, they founded or co-founded Saddleback Church back in California, I think 1980. Later in life, she founded Saddleback's Hope for Mental Health Initiative, and she did that because their son, Matthew, struggled for years with depression, and he ultimately ended his life in suicide. And because of that, she founded this mental health initiative. And her advocacy has really been a source of inspiration for a lot of people, including Suzanne White. Sarah mentioned her mom earlier in her presentation, and Suzanne often shares about ways that we can minister and do missions with mental health. And so she shared this acronym, and I'm going to share it with you as well. This acronym is from Kay Warren, and it will be helpful in guiding our conversation. And that acronym, well, let me get to that. That acronym is CHURCH. But before we look at what CHURCH stands for, I'm just going to revisit a couple of facts. 1 in 5 adults and 1 in 6 children are dealing with a mental health illness in a given year. That means that there are people in our churches, people that we work with, people that we have come in contact with every day that are struggling, and we just don't know about it. So we just need to kind of keep that in mind, that we don't know what other people are dealing with. And of course, I mean, COVID, that's made it much, much worse for a lot of people. It's a big struggle. So let's look at this acronym of CHURCH. It's care, help, unleash volunteers, remove stigma that surrounds mental illness, collaborate with the community, and hope. And we're going to go through each one of these. So care. Sometimes I get a little ahead of myself. I need to remember to keep clicking. Those who have mental illnesses and those who love and care for them, they really need to know that we care about them and that we support them. And think about ways that that people have shown you that they care about you. So would love to hear ways that you all have had people care about you that just really meant something to you when you were going through a hard time. What are some ways that people showed that they cared? Praying? Absolutely. Bringing food? Yes. Sending cards? Yeah. What was that? Coffee date? Yeah. Taking you to coffee? Yep. Telephone calls? Yes. Yeah. Any others? Listening. Yeah. We've seen that a few times today too, haven't we? Listen, listen, listen. Yep. Walking your dog. Yeah. Doing things around the house to help. Sure. Sure. So the point of all of this is we want to do the same for our friends when they're coping with mental illnesses as well. How about learning their love language? I don't even remember. I have so much stuff up in this head, and so much stuff just goes right on out of it that I don't remember some things. But there was a book called 5 Love Languages. You all familiar? Who wrote that? I don't remember who wrote it, but okay. Gary Chapman. Yay, you guys are using my brain. Or, no, you guys are being my brain is what I should say. So he wrote this 5 love languages, and that was something that was really helpful. If you can kind of figure out what your friend's love language is and figure out how you can best show them that you care about them. Being attentive to what is meaningful to them. Inviting them to a church event or something in the community, because a lot of times people who are dealing with mental illness, they feel marginalized, they feel left out, and so they may tell you no 15 times, but the 16th time they may tell you yes. So inviting them to things and just letting them know that you're thinking about them, really just being a friend. That's the first one, care. H is for help. It stands for help. Help them with practical needs. Sarah already mentioned walking the dog. Amy Simpson, in her book called Troubled Minds, she refers to mental illness as the illness without a casserole. You had mentioned taking casseroles. Oftentimes when somebody is ill, like medically ill, they need to eat, they need to go to appointments, they need to have clean clothes. Same thing with mental illness. Antil talked about depression and how sometimes just getting up out of the bed is all that somebody can do. So somebody could really use some help with food, help with getting to the appointments, help with getting their clothes cleaned, their lawns mowed, their kids to school and back. Things like that. No different. And it's often even more important to really focus on hearing and seeing the things that we may not think about, because people are going to be struggling while they're dealing with everything that mental illness involves, and so they're tired. The caregivers rarely get a break to run errands, to have an evening off, that kind of a thing. So picking people up from scouts, from soccer, from band practice, all of those things. Cutting the grass, we talked about all of that. Just spending time, maybe helping with homework. Unleash volunteers. This goes hand in hand with the H of the help. Our churches really are comprised of people with many gifts and abilities. I bet just in this room there's a lot of different gifts and abilities. Yes? Yes. So some people are really great with the elderly. Others are great with children. Some love to bake. Others are excellent with conversation and games. So no one person can or should take on all the responsibilities of reaching out and ministering to someone. Kathy mentioned know your limits, set your boundaries, solicit help from a lot of people, and you'll be more successful in the long run, right? Because if we try to do it all ourselves, what happens? We burn out. Yeah. R, remove the stigma surrounding mental health illness. Mental illness for way too long has been associated with demon possession, sinfulness, persecution, and witchcraft. And it's none of those things. Just a few years ago, Antil and I had the opportunity to be able to go to Romania with a partnership through the Baptist General Association of Virginia, and We were going as a part of a team that dealt with human trafficking, and so we got to go to a lot of different churches. And I remember this one lady who absolutely refused to accept that she had depression, and because it was something wrong with her, or something that she did that caused it. That's what she felt like, that it was a punishment for something she did. And by the end of that conference, she had accepted the fact that it wasn't her fault, that it was a mental illness that she couldn't control, so that she was able to get help for that. And it just released a burden from her. And that's something that we need to do. We need to help people. We need to raise the awareness. We need to reduce the stigma so that we can help release these burdens and make people understand and help people understand that it's not their fault. This is a mental illness just like every other illness. Another way we can reduce stigma, during our prayer time, somebody mentioned prayer earlier. We talk about things like back surgeries, cancers, kidney failures, heart disease, but we don't often hear people say, "Can you please pray for my brother? He's suffering from panic attacks." Or, "Can you please pray for my niece? She's in the hospital with suicidal thoughts." But if we are able and we feel like we can share this, then that's going to help somebody else who is struggling with the same issues. And that helps release that stigma. The suffering in silence is just not helpful for anyone. Mental illness, 1 in 5, 1 in 6. It is widespread. No one is helped if we pretend that it doesn't exist. We can't be the bird that sticks our head in the sand, right? All right. C, collaborate with community. Navigating the mental health care system can be convoluted, it can be confusing, and most people have no clue where to start getting help. So you may not be surprised to know that a lot of people, and it's already been mentioned too, a lot of people turn to the church first for help. So it is very important for a church staff to have a list of organizations and trusted counselors that you can refer people to help. Sarah had mentioned NAMI, National Alliance on Mental Illness. They have a lot of good information for advocacy, support groups, and referrals. So that's a very important thing. And I understand that some of the things that you all are considering would be possibly hosting a mental health support group here at New Prospect Baptist Church. So I'd like to spend just a little bit of time talking about this. There are 2 types of support groups. It's NAMI Connection, and that is a group that supports people that have mental health conditions. And then there is a family support group, and this is for family members, significant others, and close friends of people with mental health conditions. So what do you need to be able to start a support group at your church? Well, you need to have a space to meet. You got that one, right? Check mark that one. It's really helpful to be able to have 2 facilitators, and that's because sometimes the facilitators can kind of play off of each other, help get conversations turned around, or if somebody's really struggling, a facilitator can take somebody aside and just help them process whatever is going on. It also is important for the facilitator, if it's the NAMI Connection group, for that facilitator to be able to, or they need to have a mental health condition. If it is the family support group, that facilitator needs to either be a family member, a significant other, or a close friend of somebody that they're caring for that has a mental health condition. And the reason for that is because the facilitator needs to be able to speak with authenticity and really be able to relate to that person or the persons that are coming for this group. The facilitator is also a role model on how to find balance when you're dealing with mental health conditions. There needs to be a commitment to facilitate a group for at least a year. Why do you think that is? Yes, you're building trust. It is hard to come to a support group, whether you have a mental health condition or you are a caregiver of somebody with a mental health condition. It is hard to come. You've got to be vulnerable. You've got to put trust in people, and you have to just build those relationships, and that is a really hard thing to do. And so we need to be able to commit to at least a year, but they prefer for it to be a lot longer. One of the things that NAMI does provide is a free virtual 2-day training for facilitators that helps them learn how to go through that process, how to keep meetings productive and positive, and provide a structured process. And it's beneficial for a facilitator to know the resources. We talked about that directory earlier. The group could meet once a week. They could meet once a month. They could meet twice a month. It's whatever works best for your church. And one thing that NAMI does ask is that you stay in communication. It helps them be able to support you, but it also gives them data that they need to be able to get the grants to be able to keep running the support groups in different areas. So that's an important element as well. And we're going to come back and talk about those in just a minute. The principles of support, I'm not going to really spend any time on that, but these are the things that at each meeting you talk about to begin with, and then there is a significant amount of sharing time as well. And you can, one other thing before we get to our next part, you can join an online support group to be able to get a feel for what a support group looks like so that you can get a better feel of whether this is something you can do at your church. And they also offer publicity to be able to help you educate the community about why you need to do this. And one thing that when I was talking with the lady from NAMI, one of the things she said is sometimes people have these groups and nobody shows up for many meetings, several meetings in a row. Don't give up, because it takes time. It takes courage for people to be able to come. It takes publicity. People need to be able to know about it, and word of mouth, that kind of a thing. So don't give up if you have people that just if people are not showing up to your meetings, because eventually the word will get out and it'll help. Some other things that you can do. There's something called FaithNet, and this is an information exchange network of NAMI members, friends, clergy, and congregations of all faith traditions who would like to create a more welcoming and supportive faith community for people who have been touched by serious mental illness. They encourage the role of faith in recovery for those who faith is a component of their experience. The resource is online. It provides information, tools, outreach materials, and other resources. It is not a religious network, but it is a mental health education and awareness outreach that is available to clergy and congregations of all faith traditions to be able to be available for individuals who seek faith as a component of their recovery. Does that make sense? That's a lot of words. Good. Okay. Also provides resources on how to bring spirituality and faith-related element to the support groups. So this is an example of a support group from their website. It kind of goes through. You see that there's fellowship time, there's an educational component, devotions and scripture readings, prayer time and sharing, and then a closing. And there's several examples of that on their website. And I'd like to share one more thing under this particular part of the acronym, and that is advocacy. Now, if we look at the Merriam-Webster dictionary, it defines advocacy as the act or process of supporting a cause or a proposal. Now, this definition makes us kind of shy away from it, doesn't it? It makes us a little nervous. It doesn't sound a whole lot like missions, but if we think about it a little bit further and we think about what advocacy means, it means speaking out on behalf of a person, right? It means using your voice to be able to help change a situation, to empower others to advocate for themselves. So when we think about mental health advocacy, we are caring for others, we're caring for our neighbors, we are using our voice to be able to change situations for the better. Now, oftentimes we hear this word advocacy in correlation with policy changes and bills, and that is a part of advocacy. Just last week on May 12th, several bills were voted on by the House of Representatives that dealt with strengthening suicide prevention efforts, improving how emergency rooms respond to persons with mental health conditions, and several other things. And people did advocate for these bills, but that's not for everyone. And there are many other things about advocacy. Advocacy is bigger than just passing those bills. Being an advocate is supporting someone who needs help. It's volunteering for mental health organization or serving on the mental health council in your community. It is showing up here today because you were bringing awareness to this subject. it's just bringing the awareness and the education and reducing that stigma. So we do want to keep this conversation going and discover how we can be a voice of hope in this community. And then finally, the last H. H stands for hope. We want to offer hope. No one has more hope than Jesus, right? We find our hope in Jesus. Colossians 3:16 through 17 reminds us to let the message about Christ in all its richness fill your lives. Teach and counsel each other with all the wisdom he gives. Sing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs to God with thankful hearts. And whatever you do or say, do it as a representative of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks through him to God the Father. Each of us is the grateful recipient of the grace of God. May we extend that grace and love and forgiveness to those who are living with mental illness. We are going to take a brief break. It's 11:20. We're going to take a brief break. You'll be able to go to the bathroom, grab a snack, whatever you need to do, and then we are coming back at 11:30 for our question and answer panel. So hopefully on those pieces of notebook paper, you've got lots of questions for us. So we'll be back in 10 minutes.